The format of what we're going to be doing tonight is I've asked Rabbi Manhoff to sort of get us going by giving us an overview on Jews and comics and the interrelation between our shared identity and our particular form of art or literature. And so he's going to sort of set up how Jews and comics go together, what the interconnection is. After that, our three creator panelists will introduce their work, what they do, both in terms of how they ended up doing it and also how it's Jewish and how this is part of being a Jewish creative person. And after we get an introduction to how Jews and comics go together from people who are doing it in their own work, Craig and I will try to help out as well. We'll start asking some questions and seeing what we can draw out in terms of conversation. So that is our plan. Thank you for being here. And without further ado, Rabbi Manhoff.
Well, good evening. It's a real thrill to be here, I got to tell you. I don't know how I can be on a panel with scholars and people who really know what they're talking about, but I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that you're here too. I guess I became the comic book rabbi in 1992 when my then 8-year-old son and I discussed the possibility of Superman really dying or not. It seemed to me like that was an impossibility, so I said to him, let's go buy the one where he dies, and next week we'll go back and find out how he comes back to life. Because remembering when I was a kid, there was nothing more than a two-issue story. And I didn't know any better. Make a long story short, after a year passed and we were completely sucked into the entire DC universe, I said, there's got to be a reason I'm doing this. And so I began to look into a little bit of the history of Jews in comic books. And I wanted to figure out why, Siegel, Schuster, Kane, Finger, all the original creators of the DC world were Jewish. And I started with the premise, incorrectly, I will tell you at the very beginning, that the Jews went into comic books for the same reason that Jews went into Hollywood, which was nobody really wanted to do it. It was a low-class form of entertainment. It was for people for immigrants and uneducated people, because the real arts were on the stage, right? And nobody really understood what was going to happen with Hollywood. And so these couple of Jewish moguls go there and they begin to create an entire world. So I thought, okay, so that must be what happened in comic books, that real writers wrote for real publishers, and therefore these Jewish kids had to write for up-and-coming people who would do an industry that nobody else was doing. Wrong. Jewish publishing was very well established by the Second World War. After the Depression, we had Alfred Knopp, we had Simon Schuster, Viking Press, Modern Library, Harlem Books that came up with the idea of selling overstock books to the drugstores, pocketbooks, first paperbacks, cheap novels, Book of the Month Club, Literary Guild. These are all Jews in publishing. And so it wasn't because Jews couldn't get into publishing that they began publishing comic books. It came about by a very different way. And I thought that you'd probably all know enough about Jerry Siegel and Schuster and all the other creators of the comic books and how they're Jewish. I want to get into some of the editors and the publishers and how they got involved. And the story goes back to the American News Company. If you remember the movie Newsies and the kids that used to go hawking newspapers, they were bucking the system. The system was to sell newspapers through newsstands. And Hearst decides he's going to buck the system. He gets these Newsies, and these Newsies get beaten up by American News Company. So Hearst gets these young, well, they're called independent distributors, IDs. They were described in one of the books I read as young, aggressive, urban, mostly Jewish, glad-handing local enforcers and sweet-talking. They were able to sweet-talk mom-and-pop store owners into taking the newspapers and the comic books into their stores. And so we begin to get comic books showing up in drugstores and tobacco stores and little things like this. And this is how the comic book industry begins before we have superheroes. Superheroes were considered stupid to do for print publishing in the 30s until the late 30s. And of course, you know that Siegel and Schuster's Superman was rejected over and over and over again. And then in a moment of desperation, they added Superman into Action Comics 1 because they just didn't have anything ready. So they put this drawing in. And of course, by the end of the week, it was a major, major success. And so what happens at that point in history is that that Harry Donenfeld, who was a pulp magazine publisher, and Jack Leibowitz, who was his accountant, take over national periodical publications and begin to do comic books. And they become very successful. As a matter of fact, one of their, I lost my note, their accountant, seeing the first results of the first Action 1, decides he's going to leave. He goes out to lunch and opens up an office down the hall and starts recruiting his artists in order to go into the comic book business. And that eventually becomes Marvel. So the Donenfeld and Leibowitz were Detective Comics, which becomes DC. So basically, it was these young men who got the comic books out into the world. They survived the Depression and then the early 30s by basically being soft porn. These comic books that are drawn kind of pornographically, not quite, and the horror stuff that eventually gets driven out of business by the comic code. And it's not until the late 30s that we get the capes. So the capes are encouraged by these Jews in the business already, and the two that I think are most significant really come at in the middle, or 1941, Mort Weisinger, 1941, Jacob Kurtzberg, who you probably know as Jack Kirby. They become the major influence in the two different companies moving forward with these new superheroes. And Mort Weisinger, just as an aside, because this is the way my mind works, and with a lot of asides, I'm really Talmudic, and so I just go to the next Talmudic topic, and then maybe I'll get back to the original one. Mort Weisinger, because it's Passover, it all makes connections somewhere in my brain. It's Passover. Mort Weisinger created the Krypton as part of the Superman story, and had it written, and because he saw the rocket leaving Krypton as Moses in the basket, and then he sees the destruction of Krypton really as a Holocaust. And this is part of his character of humanizing Superman, is to make him into this, to have this theme behind without ever mentioning it. You know that Mort Weisinger was the one who wrote these pages at the end of the DC comic books that were on social values that he felt were important. He also felt that Superman had to have a human ethical code. And when he violated it, like whenever he tried to change history. Remember, Superman could fly around the planet enough times that he'd go back into time? And every time he tried to change history, he failed. Because this was what was called super hubris. He just didn't have the right to do that, and so he couldn't. So he couldn't change history as much as he tried. And about this time, in 1944, is when my friend, Julius Schwartz, Alava Shalom, got involved in comic books. Julius Schwartz was a science fiction aficionado. He created the first fanzine, which was a magazine created by fans about science fiction when there really was no science fiction yet. It was, like so many of these others, printed in a garage on a mimeograph machine and sent out to 100 or so people. But he convinced some of the greats that he could be their agent. Ray Bradbury was one of his original accounts. And then during the war, paper was too valuable to waste on science fiction. So he didn't have any more work to do. Comic books, on the other hand, were being sent to the GIs. So that's why comic books survive World War II. And so in 44, he needs a job. his friend Alfred Besser, who was writing Green Lantern at the time, says, "Come on in, we need an editor." And he comes in to, he reads a comic book on the subway on his way over to the interview and gets a job as an editor at DC. I had so many hours of fun sitting with him at the various Comic-Cons and even a couple here at WonderCon and when it was in Oakland. And I would sit with him and he'd tell me about all the Jews in comic books, and not necessarily whether they were religious, but that he would name them all and then he'd start telling stories about them. And it was just, he was just a wonderful, I kept writing to him, and when I would write, he'd write back to me. He'd send me a baseball card with his picture on it, right? And he'd sign it. And I have this whole collection of Julius Schwartz baseball kind of cards with his signature. They're all the same. Don't think that like there's one year after year. It's the same card that must have come out, and he must have had a lot of them, and he signed them every time he wrote to me. So this is one of the prizes of my collections. So Julie was the one who brought us out of the characters from the Golden Age into the Silver Age. And he created characters like the second Flash and the second Green Lantern. And he created characters. He does the first marriage between superheroes. Hawkman and Hawkgirl get married. Elongated Man marries Sue, right? And also one of my favorites is the Atom, right? Ray Palmer can't marry Laurie because she's got a career. She's a lawyer and she doesn't have time for him to get married. All of Julie's characters, as he saw them, were strong female characters, and he was really very committed to the idea of the strong female character. And just one more thought, and then I'll let the people who really know what they're talking about talk. Julius once said to me, and I don't think I ever saw this in writing, he said to me, he never wanted Superman to win a battle by pure strength. He always wanted Superman to do it by outthinking the enemy, the opponent. And for Julius, this was really important. Knowledge was much more important than the superpowers and being intelligent and being educated and using your mind. He would love today's Batman. It wasn't the one that he knew, but he would have loved it. He actually created the Batman that was the television joke. But he would really much prefer the Frank Miller Dark Knight, I think. I miss him a lot. He really taught me a lot about Jews and comic books. Hope you enjoyed that.
My name is Michael Aushenker. I'm a humor cartoonist. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm originally from, by the way, I'm disappointed that his DC Comics tie doesn't have the Phantom Stranger on it, but that's just me. But anyway.
It's on the back. Where else would he be?
Okay. I originated from Brooklyn, New York, and I moved to Los Angeles when I was 8. And I think, you know, I grew up in a Jewish-Italian neighborhood. I think my background probably, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about that, okay. But, you know, I didn't grow up in a religious Jewish home, but I think being Jewish, you always have some kind of relationship with your culture. And also, you know, especially when you're growing up, you're a little conscious of it because the dominant culture is not Jewish. It's a, you know, it's a minority. And so I think you're always a little bit of an outsider, and I think you're always, or at least you feel that way when you're growing up. And I think that plays a lot into, you know, whether I do consciously Jewish characters or not. And in general, I don't, but I think sometimes there's crossover. But there's always that relationship with that. And I think what makes some characters Jewish, whether they're ostensibly Jewish or not, I think there's always this kind of outsider quality and kind of like an irreverence. And I think we see that in our movies. There's that whole history of comedy with the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges, and it goes all the way to Adam Sandler and Borat and all that stuff. And there's always that kind of, you know, the Jew is the kind of the outsider, kind of commenting on our culture, and or stirring up trouble. And I think, you know, I found that my influences, in addition to Marvel and DC Comics that I grew up with, A lot of it came from the animation world. I really enjoyed like Warner Brother cartoons and Popeye, you know, the Fleischer Popeyes, and what else? Woody Woodpecker was big. Not all of them were created by Jews, but I always connected with these kind of irreverent characters, you know, Woody Woodpecker and Daffy Duck and the Jay Ward stuff. So, you know, like Super Chicken and Bullwinkle. And I think that's, you know, that all fed into my mind. And I think, you know, in terms of my cartoons, I do these kind of books. They're very absurdist, and they're basically gag cartoons. I've got a series that includes this bellhop. I've got another comic that I recently put out called Harry Lowell, and that's a little more overtly Jewish because it's about as autobiographical as I've ever gotten. It's this volatile roller coaster of a relationship that is influenced by something I went through in my personal life with a modern Orthodox Jewish girl that I dated. And it's about as, you know, when I dated her, you know, I was really actually a little bit of an outsider within my own culture because I didn't grow up religious. And so suddenly I had a window into the more religious Jewish world, and I was kind of learning things and also seeing things that, you know, that I liked and that also I thought was a little hypocritical at the time. And so, you know, a lot of that commentary went into this book. And, you know, so I think as a Jew, you can be an outsider in the mainstream culture and even in your own culture if you maybe, you know, grew up in a secular way or a reform way. So anyway, I'm rambling, but that's all part of kind of what I do as a humor cartoonist. So I'm going to pass the mic now before someone takes it away. Thank you.
I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I did grow up in a modern Orthodox household. But kind of, I guess, the way that I felt outsidery was being a Jew in Columbus, Ohio, rather in one of these big, you know, Jewish type cities. But after high school, I didn't really feel like going to college yet, so I went to Israel instead, which my older brother and my older sister had gone to yeshiva. And I wasn't really cut out for yeshiva, but I found this year program that was all Israelis, and just in the course of that year, I fell in love with the whole country, and I fell in love with every Israeli I met, and I made Aliyah and joined the army in what felt like fairly short order. And so I had a year and 9 months of IDF, a regular girls' tour of duty. I was a secretary in the middle of the desert for basically the first 2 years of the Intifada, from 2000 to 2002. And then immediately after, I started university in Seattle. I moved back to the States and started university in a, you know, again, a not terribly Jewish city. And so kind of the first year that I was back from Israel, I basically just sat on my experiences. Like, I didn't really talk about it that much. It just seemed too strange to relate to my daily life in Seattle. It wasn't until a year later when I transferred to art school in Vancouver, Canada, that I kind of found my Israel experience coming into my art, and found my art also becoming a lot more Jewish than it had been. You know, growing up in an Orthodox community, and then, you know, living in Israel, I never kind of felt a need to assert my Judaism in art. You know, I was more apt to be rebelling against, you know, what I saw as strictures of Judaism in art, such as, you know, taking nude figure drawing classes as a teenager while being an Orthodox girl. But once I got to Vancouver, which is an even less Jewish town than Seattle, I kind of really felt that how much I wasn't a visible minority, you know, that if I, you know, didn't tell anybody that I was Jewish and, you know, or that my name was Miriam, that probably, you know, most people would never know. And that freaked me out a bit, because it you know, was such a core part of my identity that I just kind of found any art that I did was just being super Jewy and Jewier and Jewier. And so another thing that happened was just kind of as a short project in one of my art classes, I took one of my Army diary entries and adapted it into a 5-page comic. And I had always read comics, but I never drew a comic before. Like, I always read comics and I always drew, but I never thought that I could draw a comic because I just didn't think I had that kind of discipline to draw the same character over and over. And to, keep on in, narrative arc and draw backgrounds and all that sort of things just seemed too hard. But kind of once I showed this 5-page comic to my classmates, then everybody was very intrigued, and they're like, you never talked about being in the Army, and let's hear more Army stories and stuff. And so kind of that's when I decided that I wanted to do my military service, that the best way for me to talk about it was to draw a comic. So that's basically when I taught myself to draw comics, is because I already had a story. And so kind of slowly over the next few years, we did slightly longer stories, and now it's, my goal is to do like the year and 9 months of my Army service in comics form. And I've got the first graphic novel of it out. This is the first third, which took me about 5 years, so it'll be probably about 10 years, another 10 years before I finish telling a less than 2-year period. But comics is very slow. That's another thing I learned. At the same time, when I was in art school, it was, I would say that the art school I went to was not a very crafts-oriented and not very commercial-oriented either. Like, it was very conceptually oriented and very highbrow, and kind of I got really eviscerated in a couple of my classes for bringing in things that looked like comics. Even when they weren't comics, anything with googly eyes, people just were terribly, terribly offended. And so that's kind of how I started experimenting in this other path that now I'm just almost as passionate about as my jobnik stuff. My essay, Towards a Hot Jew, I call it a drawn essay, and what I have up there is an image of another drawn essay, which I'll get to, but you get kind of the idea that it's not really comics and it's not really an illustrated essay, but it's kind of somewhere in between. And so what I did, this was basically my senior project in art school, that I had a bunch of photographs that I had taken in Israel, kind of doing research for Jobnik, and I just kind of found myself drawn to, taking photographs of Israeli soldiers. And I just wanted to analyze that phenomenon of, I guess I had always, when I was a kid and traveled to Israel, I'd always been really drawn to the Israeli soldiers and really fascinated by them, and they seemed, terribly big and strong and romantic. And then I was an Israeli soldier, and it sucked. And then why, when I go back to Israel, was I kind of drawn to, again, taking these very iconic photos and studying these very iconic photos of soldiers. And so that was kind of the germ of the idea for this piece. And then, so first I had kind of the photo reference, and then I wanted to do an essay about why do Israeli soldiers have this image? Like, it's not just the guns, it's not just the uniforms. There really is something about the image of Israeli soldier that represents something to American Jews and also represents something to, it seems like, Western media at large. And so that's when I did this project, which is kind of the text of an essay with a bunch of, I guess, Rabbi Manhoff would say, Talmudic asides as well to the main text, about kind of my thoughts about this phenomenon. But because I couldn't, draw comics for class, what I ended up doing was taking each page, as you see here, which the originals are drawn about 10 by 14. So I took them to Kinko's, I blew them all up on the giant plotter as big as they would go. So each page was 4 by 5 feet, and I hung it up around the walls of a studio so that it wasn't a comic, it was an installation. So it was okay. And so that was my senior project in art school, and that also, people were very intrigued by that, and people liked it a lot. And when I, shrunk it back down and actually bound it like a comic, which is what it, really was all the time, and brought it to conventions where I was selling my jobnik books, it also got just like a really good reaction, although it's also, you know, this is my piece where I got called an anti-Semite on the internet, which I guess everybody has to go through at one point in time or another. Right, exactly. And so this one just led to wanting to do more things with comics or just with words and pictures that were more sort of experimental, and I've done several more since then. What's projected up there is a piece that I did that eventually got published in a book by Rutgers University Press about Jews in comics. And my piece was about the genre of autobio comics, the North American genre of autobio comics, and sort of the Jewish connections of that, the history of it, the aesthetics of it, what's Jewy about it, and how I got into it, because, you know, you can't draw an essay about autobiographical comics without, you know, self-insertion. And so that's kind of the piece there. Like, in my argument, I trace it from Roth, especially Portnoy's Complaint, which I feel was a big, big influence on his generation and the artists of his generation, to Crumb, who is not a Jew, but a friend of the Jews, to Justin Green, who is Catholic but has a Jewish father who is very prominent in his memoirs, and of course Harvey Pekar, and trace it kind of to the current idiom of autobio in comics, you know, again, whether the practitioners are actually Jewish or just have some sort of Jewish influenced aesthetic, as I argue, you know, to my own work. And so I'll probably be talking about that more because that's my Jews and comics piece. But I guess that pretty much sums it up.
I'm going to stand up. I really am glad to hear everything that's said, because I'm very much a part of what you've been talking about, in the sense that personal experience led me into the world of comics too, and the comics in a way reflect my own recent experience, but because I don't draw and I only write stories, I'm going to show you in a minute some drawings done by my friend Spain, with whom I've worked for the past 5 years. And I'll talk about this one in a minute, but first I want to say how I got into this business of creating comics that Spain illustrates. I write the stories. Initially, as a teacher of theater history, I was doing research on Yiddish theater, and as you may know, this is a theater that was created by Jews, first in Eastern Europe, then in other countries, including the United States, when they immigrated. And the Yiddish theater in this country is no longer really very vibrant. It's practically extinct, not completely extinct. But as I investigated the history of Jewish and Yiddish theater, I found many scenes were not preserved. That is, people hadn't translated the plays. There were not photographs of many of the plays that interested me. And since Spain was a friend and a great illustrator, who, if you don't know his work, Spain began in the period of Zap Comics with Crumb and Spiegelman and others, and he still does wonderful drawings for many different places. And in recent years, he's begun to draw some Jewish imagery, particularly about the theater, because I wrote these stories about the history of Yiddish theater, which he illustrated. And in a way, we were recreating the history and scenes from that theater history that cannot be found anywhere, certainly cannot be seen anymore. So we had a graphic visual equivalent to what was a lost, almost extinct theater. Some of the work that we did is in this anthology, Jews in American Comics. I think Miriam is in this book too. And this book also is interesting to me because it suggests the continuity from Yiddish comic strips in the United States early in the century through to the present. While there are certainly English language Jewish comics and other influences, there is a tradition of doing comics in Yiddish, particularly in the 1920s, 1930s, artists like Zuni Maud and William Gropper would draw very interesting cartoons and comics in Yiddish. And then another influence on both Spain and myself that we wanted to pay tribute to was Mad Magazine and Harvey Kurtzman. As you probably know, Harvey Kurtzman in the 1950s was really the writer behind this great magazine, comic book, Mad. And he worked with a lot of illustrators, Wally Wood, Jack Davis, John Severin. But Kurtzman wrote virtually all the stories for the first comics of Mad. And so Spain and I at one point paid tribute to him. I'm just going to read, I don't know if you can see the words in these reproductions, so I'll read the text, which I wrote. Harvey Kurtzman, Madman. At EC Comics, a publishing house devoted to horror, weird science, and warfare, Harvey Kurtzman, 1924 to 1993, created Mad. And Kurtzman is saying, that's Mad Comics. Mutually assured destruction came later. Then you see Harvey as a teenager, and it says as a teenager he drew his first comics, Ike and Mikey, on the sidewalks of New York. Then there's a portrait of his of soldiers reading Two-Fisted Tales, which Kurtzman first illustrated for William Gaines at EC Comics. And one of the soldiers is saying, guts without glory. The other soldier says, he's got that right. The next installment, in 1952, Kurtzman invented Mad. His parodies turned Tarzan into Melvin of the Apes, Archie into Starchy, Joe McCarthy into a quiz show panelist. And so you see these characters. The next installment says, legendary comic book scholar Professor Joe Suris says, in Harvey, from his early Hey Look strips to his mad mockery of consumer culture, we find the spirit of Purim, the holiday where nothing is sacred. Harvey's mother was a secular Jew, but for Harvey, every day was Purim. Then Joe Suris says, I almost forgot to mention schmaltz, the chicken fat style created by Kurtzman and his old high school pal Bill Elder, crammed frames full of roadside signs, puns, and asides. And you see those signs in the picture. Next page, do we have that with the canoe? Mad introduced, oh, we're already there. Mad introduced innocent young readers to a wealth of Yiddishisms that Kurtzman may have heard at home or at left-wing Yiddish summer camp Kinderland. And the canoe rowers are saying, we want to see the girls at Nit Gedeiget, not to worry. That's what I said, Nit Gedeiget. Those of you who know Mad Magazine well will know that in the Mark Trade parody of Mark Trail, there is a reference to Nit Gedeiget. The Boy Scouts keep saying, we want to see Nit Gedeiget. Well, that was actually a Yiddish summer camp, and the Yiddish translated means not to worry. So in Mad Magazine, Kurtzman was actually writing these jokes about a Yiddish summer camp, and you have to wonder how many of these young readers actually got the joke, how many of them knew what he was referring to. It was probably a small percentage of the readers, but I refer to this because it suggests the Yiddish influence on Kurtzman, and in Mad, sort of between the lines, you can see certain Yiddish jokes. And as I said, this word, Nit Gedeiget, means not to worry. Well, if you know the Alfred E. Newman question, what me worry, I read Mad, I just wonder if that didn't come out of Nit Gedeiget. You know, this Yiddish phrase could have been one inspiration for that great motto, what me worried. So I won't go into the whole comic strip. There's a little more about Kurtzman refusing to work with Gaines after he couldn't get 51% control of Mad, trying to start other magazines, then working with a young man named Robert Crumb, who was one of his assistants or friends early in Crumb's career. Then Kurtzman, to earn a living, worked for Playboy, creating Little Annie Fanny. But in the last picture, you see some of the characters created by later artists, underground comic artists, who were influenced by Kurtzman. These include Wonder Warthog, Trash Man, Lenore Goldberg, Mouse, and Zippy, who were all created by the generation that followed Mad, that followed Kurtzman, but I think his influence was tremendous on American comics, and that's what we were trying to say, as well as the influence of Yiddish and Jewish culture on Kurtzman, which can be found in some of Mad. Now, I'm going to very briefly, I don't want to take time, just refer to this other cartoon, comic strip Spain and I did about Yiddishkeit, that is Yiddish culture in the 21st century. This is a series of quotes from people I met who had seen Yiddish theater, and each of them told me some interesting facts about the actors they saw. One of them sold a fur coat to Molly Pecan. Another one saw Jetta Zwirling lose her wig, and one of them watched Stella Adler audition for the Hebrew Actors Union, and so on. This is another way for me to preserve Yiddish culture and kind of illustrate a history that's disappearing by using comic strips. Thank you very much.
I can't believe I'm on a panel with all these anti-Semites. And I think I should maybe be called a discuss-nick instead of a discussant for tonight. So there are many directions that we could go with this. But all of you seem to hit on Jewishness, obviously, and comics, and this connection that seems to be there, and traditions that have been set up with comics and representing Jewishness, Jewish involvement in comics. And so, which leads to all sorts of questions in terms of definition, and, you know, what is Jewish? What does it mean to represent Jewishness, to represent Jews, especially Jews, when you consider a history of anti-Semitic images, centuries of that, and then, you know, in part, you know, your work is a response to that in some ways. It's unavoidable. And what are comics? And all sorts of definitional issues related to that. I don't know if saying comics is a comfortable thing for you. Saying visual narratives, sequential art, I don't know what you like. Maybe in our discussion you can say if there's something you prefer. I don't know. But I'm kind of wondering, and Michael, you touched on this when you talked about your relationship with culture, Jewish relationship with culture, more secular and outside, which I can relate to. And so I'm sort of wondering, does, for the panelists, does Jewishness shape your comic style, or does your comic style actually shape your Jewishness? And in some ways, maybe another way to put that, so it's not a yes or no answer, is does the composition of comics make you more Jewish in some way? Does it add to your Jewishness?
I guess I was just thinking about this when you were presenting on your Harvey Kurtzman comic, the fact that he has all these little, you know, lots of things going on inside the panel. And I think that it's not always evident in my comics, but I think that I'm definitely more towards that end than towards a sort of very minimalist, you know, decompressed, like, you know, that one sort of image which is supposed to make you feel melancholy, lone little person on a page sort of thing that is a little bit more, I feel, popular with my generation of cartoonists. And, you know, not to say because that's easier to draw and then you can whip out a 500-page graphic novel like that. But I just think that it just made me think that I'm definitely more sympathetic to the idea of cramming in lots of little side notes and things that you might not get the first time into a panel, and I would like to think that that is Jewish, which I guess answers another question, which is that I do feel connected to a Jewish tradition in some way, and maybe it's even a bit of a substitute for, the Orthodox milieu I used to have, is that, I'm not carrying on those traditions, in the way that my parents would like, but I'm carrying on other traditions that are just as Jewish. And so I do think my comics help with that, and also because my comics are on such Jewy themes, then I just find myself very out in public as a Jew, if I'm out in public as anything. And so
Did you say Jewy themes?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe it's Jon Stewart's word.
Yeah, it is.
I find it very useful. And so I would say that definitely my comics are Jewish and my Judaism is comic-y.
I want to hear what the other panelists say, but you bringing up Jon Stewart kind of reminded me of, I had been corresponding with Ben Katcher, the great comic artist, and I had asked him about his novel, The Jew of New York, and what makes his work Jewish, and he said that is something that you really have to qualify. It means so many different things. To an older immigrant, Jewishness has a particular meaning. It might be tied more with orthodoxy. For a younger generation, it might be The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, and that's their Jewishness. It might be the koshometer that he was using when McCain and Clinton were running against each other. That's what they have. For me, it might be Hebrew, the chosen beer, or it might be soy vey, the teriyaki sauce, and for some of us, that's all we have. And it can, and maybe in comics it can come out more. So I'd like to hear more.
I think what he hit on with the Mad magazine and Harvey Kurtzman, that's a really good example because they did throw around a lot of Yiddishness, and I think there's it's not always like a conscious Jewishness. I think there's a lot of that. That's kind of speaking to in a bizarre way a kind of a Jewish pride and a sometimes self-deprecating humor, but nevertheless. You're an outsider and an insider. When you see Blazing Saddles and the Indians arrive and it's Mel Brooks and the Indians are speaking in Yiddish. I mean, it's a mainstream kind of movie, but yet he's kind of, it's the same kind of flavor. It's like only a certain segment of the audience is really going to get it. And it's hysterical. And he's playing to, in a kind of self-deprecating way, Jewish pride. And I even saw it recently. I saw the Oscars, and it was a really lame gag, but you probably remember Ben Stiller was done up like one of the, what's that planet? From Avatar, Pandoran aliens. And he was talking in Navi, and at a certain point he threw in Purim and Pesach as part of the, what's that? Yeah, I mean, he threw in some Hebrew and some, it's this tradition that a lot of, and Ben Stiller, I believe, is half Jewish technically, and yet, it's a tradition that goes on with a lot of, and it's across the board, I think, in entertainment, comics and movies and comedy and, and music, the Beastie Boys, in their own way. Have some Jewish qualities, even though they've kind of distanced themselves at times. But even when you distance yourself from it, culturally it comes out somehow. In the irreverence and the way you kind of joke, and even when you make fun of your own culture, you're kind of connecting with it. So there's been that kind of tradition. It's not of putting it out there, and I think it doesn't always have to be. Something where you're really, teaching someone about a part of Jewish culture, although I think that's great too. And one of my favorite works of recent, last 1 or 2 years was that Exit Wounds by Rutu Modan, which an Israeli cartoonist, and she did a tremendous work. And, and yet she kind of pushed, she pushed the whole Middle East conflict to the far background. I'm sure did you read that? That's another way of approaching it. So I think it's all part of this way of relating.
It occurs to me that, with all of us, with our very disparate areas of interest and also ways of creating, it really all comes back to Mad Magazine and Harvey Kurtzman. Like, that's kind of the one connecting element for everybody. And like, you know, because if I, as a confessional artist, trace my lineage to R. Crumb, then he, you know, he goes right back to Mad Magazine, you know, being a fanboy of Mad Magazine and getting his start with Help, was it the, yeah. And the funny thing about Ruta Modan is, I don't know if you knew this, but one of the ways that she started doing comics in Israel is that she and a bunch of her art school buddies got the license to publish Mad Magazine in Hebrew. Wow. And it was just a weird, very weird license. So they got a bunch of like they had access to all the archives. So they would publish a magazine that was like half Mad archives and half original Israeli comics. And it never sold anything, but it was it was a very formative experience for her. Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably.
I should mention the editor I work with at Jewish Currents actually wrote for Mad Magazine before he became editor of this journal that now wants comics in it. But another thing that's occurred to me in beginning to learn more about comics as I work on them with Spain is that the irreverence that you find in Mad and also in some of the other political comics and even in the superhero comics has an earlier connection to some of the Jewish traditions, the cultural traditions, the secular tradition of Yiddish theater and literature, where there's a great deal of satire and humor. So it goes further back, though we may not always recognize it. I think one thing that's attracted me to this culture, and I mean comics and the Yiddish theater, is that they embody both a kind of humor, satire, social criticism through irreverence, but also they represent the Jewish tradition of seeking social justice, sometimes through the negative quality of that. But you have these superheroes who are trying to rescue people, to restore justice, to fight for truth, justice, and whatever else it is. And so within these stories, both the superheroes and the very human, more recent stories by Jewish comic strip artists, I think it represents a secular Jewish tradition seeking social justice with humor.
So I'm not a creator, and so I don't draw these things, but I'm a consumer, and I come at it from the exact opposite point of view from the other three panelists, in that definitely my Jewishness affects the way that I read the comic books and the way I use the comic books in my classrooms or from the pulpit. I will use the themes of comic books. Real quick example is trying to explain to my students at St. Mary's College the difference between the Jewish concept of Messiah and the Christian concept of Messiah is the difference between Batman and Superman. And who would you be willing to risk your life to go follow in the Judean desert in the first century, knowing that the Romans are coming with the soldiers after you? When I explained to the students that you could either follow this super guy who could fly and use heat from his eyes and whatever, or you could go to this guy who's really smart and has the weapons and just knows how to organize an army. And I asked the students to raise their hand, who are you going to go fight with? And I try to explain to them that even though I have 17,000 Superman and Batman comic books, I would go and join Batman because I'm pretty sure a man can't fly. And I think that that's really what the difference was in the first century, was those Jews who believed that the Messiah was going to be superhuman and could save them that way, and those who believed that he was going to be a great military general who was going to lead them and save them that way. So that's just one example of how the comic books really affect the way that but also all the morality and the social justice and all those points make great ways for me to read the comics. So I look for the Jewish characters and I look for the Jewish themes, and I'll find them in your writing, whether you put it there or not.
And by the way, Aquaman was not Buddhist. He was not Buddha. So.
What about Submariner? No. Okay. So that brings up another issue. Basically, I kind of was wondering if comics offer, a venue, maybe a safer venue in some ways for expressing Jewishness, but it's not always clear. It's not always explicit. It's not always blatant, like with, Superman, or like the first Captain America. That was pretty blatant. The cover, right? He's beating up Hitler in 1941, but he's Steve Rogers, and he's not, Steve Rothstein or anything. So, but then there was so you have this Jewishness in comics, and you have a lot of Jewish creators, but as far as out Jewish characters, that's something that was happening later. I mean, there was A.B. the Agent, maybe, I don't know, early on, and I'm thinking Greenblatt the Great and A.B. the Agent, but as far as other characters, I mean, that took a while for that to become more out there.
I think it's part of the times. I mean, those creators obviously were growing up at a time where it was a little dangerous to be Jewish overtly. It's not as, now we live in a multicultural time where you can play around with all kinds of things like this. But at the time, not only were these, the creators were changing their names, as you said, Jacob Kurtzberg became Jack Kirby, and Stanley Lieber became Stan Lee, and all this stuff. And but so they had to kind of encode the way they presented these characters, and anglicize their names. And Superman, and that's the greatest example. I think it was it Jules Pfeiffer in his book who started that, or who first put out that interpretation, which is absolutely true when you look closely at Superman, and he's this outsider from another world, and he changes his name, to the waspy Clark Kent, and basically the Moses parable.
He says he's not from Krypton; he's from planet Minsk.
Right. I mean, it is basically a way of delivering those feelings, without kind of being, in a crypto kind of way. And I think that definitely is more early 20th century than early 21st century. I think now we're at a point where, people are more accepting of other cultures, so people are more comfortable in having overtly ethnic characters and stories, and maybe in some ways also other cultures being popularized, like manga, like here in America, all the Asian comics being so popular, and other ways, has other ethnicities have kind of opened it up so that we can be more Jewish with our work,
Yeah, what are some other any other factors come to mind in terms of the field itself, changes in the field, and other cultural changes that led to the crypto Jew in comics not really having to be a crypto Jew anymore?
I think the examples of people like Eisner with Contract with God, which some consider the first graphic novel, and then later certainly Spiegelman with Mouse, are really getting very public images of Jews distributed through books, not just through comic books. And it may have, quote, elevated the form, although I don't feel that comics are a low form. I mean, by having graphic novels and books, suddenly there's an additional form to this kind of storytelling.
Yes, certainly. I mean, with the Contract with God, dealing with a very heavy subject, the existence of God, and in, that's 1978. You have The Silver Surfer, the graphic novel The Silver Surfer, coming out in 1978. There was also, I think it was featuring a black hero named Saber. And so, the genre, there were all sorts of changes in the genre, and then a big change in Jewishness and how that was expressed, how the subjects were dealt with, and then the development. There was Raw magazine going on, and then development of Mouse and all. And Miriam, I mean, you write about 1970s Jews in your drawn essay, and different constructions of masculinity there in the Israeli soldier. I wonder if there's maybe a correlation going on. I don't know.
When did Sabra first appear? Somebody knows this.
I think that was 78.
78, yeah. So, yeah, I think that was definitely related to the idea of Israel's place in the world, which was, a different story again than, American Jews feeling that they were more accepted in the U.S. But there was also this concern of, that Israel kind of did emerge as, almost a superhero country because of these, miraculous seeming military victories. And then, soon after, in the 80s with the first Intifada, it seemed like, oh, there's a bit of a dark side there. And so I think even Sabra went underground a bit, and then some of the stories were a bit. I remember reading a Peter David Hulk story, wherein, Hulk and Sabra in Israel, and I don't know, I think Hulk tries to free Jonathan Pollard or something. Whatever. So I think that I guess that's also that might have also been as well as being a concern of the world at large, that growing prominence of Israel as a military power. I think that was also a concern of the Jewish creators, and it started to be this sort of ambivalent relationship to Israel that Jewish Americans had, and that kind of comes through when they're creating anything, and that's certainly influence on my work. I'm all about Jewish American ambivalence towards Israel.
I was actually referring to Saber, who was a different figure.
Yes, I realize, but I mean, I think that's the case also. 70s and 80s is when not just Jews were being more out in comics, but anybody who wasn't a WASP was being more out in comics. They wanted to be relevant by having black characters.
Yeah.
And one of the first comic series, I grew up on Marvel personally, and so one of the first comic series that I read was the Chris Claremont New Mutants. And so Chris Claremont always had his different ethnicities represented. He had the Vietnamese girl, he had the Native American girl, the Scottish girl, the Appalachian guy, the Brazilian guy, and the Jewish girl. That was the New Mutants. Am I missing anybody? That she's the Jewish, yeah. Well, she joined the New Mutants afterwards. And so and the Russian guy, Colossus. And so, right, but what about Sergeant Rock, that he was diverse, right?
Oh, you mean not Sergeant Rock himself, but...
No, his company, E-Company. The E-Company for Sergeant Rock was the first integrated unit in the U.S. Army before there was really integrated units. And, there was an African American, probably a Negro. There was a Jew. There was a Native American. This was back in the, I don't know when, 50s, 60s, I think.
Late 50s, early 60s,
yeah.
by Joe Kubert, by the way.
So, yeah.
And even what you touched on, Silver Surfer and Galactus, I mean, that whole struggle, which a lot of people have interpreted as kind of going up against God and, those issues. And of course, Jack Kirby continued in the 70s with the New Gods. And that was very, direct reference to the Torah and all this stuff. So,
and those are the only characters that don't have Hebrew names. Any of the new characters, that Azrael and all the others, seem to have Hebrew names in the DC world. I think that they have a list of Jewish angels at the DC office, and they're looking for, when they need a new character, they just go down the list until they find somebody's name that fits. If you haven't seen the last issue of Azrael, where Azrael, representing this Christian knight order, squares off with Ragman, who is the Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, in a fight between some Hasidim and Palestinians in New York City, or Gotham. Maybe it's in Gotham. You really have to read it. It's an amazing story of Jewish values. It was really worth its time.
It's time to perhaps see if the audience has any questions for any of all. Well, there we go. Jews with questions.
Do I need the mic, or do you want?
We're recording, so the mic is kind of for that.
Oh, hi. So, Rabbi, I could have mistaken this from somewhere, but the number of times the letter L appeared in the Superman mythology. I'm not sure if I remember this correctly, but did it have Jewish significance where his name is Kal-El, and there's Lex Luthor, Lois Lane, Lana Lang, and then his mermaid girlfriend, Lori Lamaris? It's just the L just keeps popping up. Was there a Jewish significance, or am I remembering it incorrectly?
I've heard many different stories about that, whether Jerry Siegel really wanted it to be Jor-El and Kal-El. Remember that they start off with Kal-El as K-A-L-L. There's no E there, to make it like Kal-El, like all God or godly. Julius Schwartz said that there really was no connection between the two, that he didn't name Jor-El for himself, Jerome. And so if the L stands for God throughout the stories, then I'm missing it there. That doesn't mean I don't teach it. I mean, I certainly do, and make all my characters Jewish. So I'm really glad that the thing had a bar mitzvah and things like that.
In the scholarship on it, Danny Fingeroff, in his book on Disguised as Clark Kent, pretty much specifically says that no, it was not intended to have a Hebrew meaning. But as we know, in the postmodern age, the author is dead, and since pretty much every Jew I know attributes Hebrew meaning to Kal-El as a vessel of God or all of God, that's what it means to us. So that's where I take it. But historically, there's no direct connection.
This is in part for what Joel was talking about. I went to college with Michael, and we had a lot of comic artists there at the time, and one guy had the collected EC comics, and we looked through them, and we had fun with them. Then my two Goy roommates decided that they latched on the word Poderzibi, which I saw you had over the little poster of Alfred E. Newman in that last panel on your Spain's comic. I don't know if that's deliberate or not. But I would drive them down to the all-night supermarket. They printed up stickers on their Macs, and I would drive them down to the all-night supermarket, and they would stick Poderzibi stickers all over things like 3-gallon jars of mayonnaise. And they didn't know what it meant particularly. They were just bemused by the word itself and the simple sound of it. I had some sort of connection about how it was not necessarily relevant to Jewish culture. They knew that's where it came from, but they didn't care. They were just bemused by the simple, absurdist, an obscure Polish word that nobody knew we didn't know what it meant. And I guess my question to you is, do you know what Poderzibi means?
I'm going to let Miriam answer that one. But
I'm going to defer to, I'm sure we have an expert here who knows that, but I just want to mention Verschlagener, which I think is a great non-Yiddish word that sounds Yiddish and that keeps appearing in all those old issues of Mad. And that just complicates the matter because as far as I know, there is really no such Yiddish word, but I pass on this other one. Lou? No?
by the way, unfortunately, his story is true, and in the late 80s, early 90s, this Poderzibi was like on every road sign in upstate New York. We went to Cornell up in Ithaca, and the Poderzibi would just appear in the weirdest places, and there were even like local papers writing articles about what essentially these two guys did with this word, just spreading it like a virus everywhere. So.
I thought it was named after a Polish drink, and it's not a Yiddish word, but maybe someone else knows more about this.
I know nothing.
I hate to differ with scholars on this, but I think Verschlugene has to be a Yiddish word because my mother used it in those contexts, and she was very clear about what was and wasn't.
If your mother used it, it must be a Yiddish word.
It must be. It must be.
Maybe your mom read a lot of Mad magazine.
No,
that's all.
no, not at all. That was my brother. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask one question, and then we'll adjourn to sell books and socialize a little bit, which is, I'm curious as to what the state of Israeli comics is today. You had mentioned Rutu Modan and her group and Exit Wounds. I'm curious what might be happening in Israel, and what is the dialogue between Jewish American comics and Israeli comics today, if any?
When I was last in Israel in 2008, I arranged to do a signing at an Israeli comic book shop in Tel Aviv. And that was, no. There's at least 3 in Tel Aviv. It's crazy. I think there really is going to be, I think not just Rutu Modan, but we're going to hear more out of the Israeli comic book scene shortly, because the shop I was at, which is, as I say, one of 3 in like a 10-block radius in Tel Aviv, it's got a big old manga section, because actually manga is also being very popular in Israel right now. And I asked, is it translated into Hebrew? And they say no, they read the English manga in Israel, which means they're turning the pages the correct way for themselves, but they're reading in the wrong direction. But anyhow, so they've got a big manga section, they've got a big, Marvel DC section, they've got, more of the graphic novel-y type Western comics, and they've even got a big, and, what there is of, indigenous Israeli graphic novels, but also at the front of the store, as you'll see in many of the best comic book shops in North America, they have local artists and zines. Like, they do have, like, 2 racks of local artists, kids who come in with their stapled comics and everything, which I found, I had no idea, certainly when I was living in Israel, that anybody was doing, indie comics or zines or anything at all. The only comic that I read is Hebrew comic that I read when I was in Israel was something that Rutu Modan's group, her Actus Tragicus collective, had done, which was a bunch of adaptations of Edgar Kerrett's stories in comic form, which was really cool. And a bunch of Edgar Kerrett has been adapted into comics by different artists. Pizzeria Kamikaze by Asaf Chanukah is also a really great book that came out, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And so I think it's a small scene, but I think it's significant, and it's going to get more significant, and you're gonna see more Israeli comics, I think.
I just want to tell you a story. We were in Israel, and I've been looking for the old Ish Barzel comics, which were translations of Superman for the either Maariv or Diot newspaper. They had Superman strips. This was a while ago, 60s, 70s. And then they were collected into comic books pretty much the way that the original comic books were slapping together comic strips from the newspaper into the magazine. So I've been looking all over for those and used bookstores and everything. And while we were in Israel, I wanted to go to the comic book store and pick up my weekly comic books, and looked in the phone book, and of course couldn't find comic books listed in Hebrew or in English in the yellow pages. But we were driving downtown Tel Aviv to the mall, whatever it's called. I forgot the name of it. Maybe Dizengoff Mall, I think. And we're on the bus, and we see the comic shop, and we plead with the driver to stop and let us get off so we can run back to the comic book store. And of course, all the comic books in English were 2 weeks old. The new ones were 2 weeks old. We had those already. But anyway, so I didn't know there were more than one in Tel Aviv.
What you saw was probably CNV, big yellow sign, yellow awning, Comics Virakot, which translates to comics and vegetables, even though they do not sell vegetables. I think it's actually a Passover reference, that it's Comics Vishar Yarakot, as in comics and all sorts of vegetables, meaning comics, etc. That's what I think it is, but I haven't actually asked them what is the meaning of their store's name. But yeah, they get the Diamond catalog and they get everything behind schedule. But and of course there's Zbang, which was kind of the Hebrew Archie comics that became its own TV show. And there's, what's his face, Uri Fink, who's been doing kind of very small things for a long time. And there's a lot of political cartoons, but, you know, those are just kind of depressing.
Craig or Lou, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, I actually was going to just say a couple things. And that one of the great things about comics is because of their deep, deep roots, their deep, deep Jewish roots, comics are in a lot of ways a link to being Jewish. And what exactly we mean by being Jewish, you have a few days, you know. We're not going to decide tonight, but what can happen is either through some of the older stuff, the Batman, the Superman, the core ideas of justice and fighting the good fight with power and responsibility, all the way to the more modern, more contemporary, where we can overtly discuss our Jewishness in comic books and see other people discuss theirs, that comics are a way of giving us an ongoing connection with our identity. And it's an amazing thing that on, you know, someday where you're just sitting there on Shabbat trying to find something to read and you're like, yeah, this is Superman, but you know what, this totally fits in. Sometimes it's a little more overt, sometimes it's a little more subtle, but of course as Jews we can find a Jewish theme in anything. And since there is a Jewish DNA, I think, in all comics, whether they're directly made by Jews or for Jews, this is, comics become a way for us to understand ourselves a little more and connect with who we are. And I think that is a marvelous thing that comics and the comic creators give us on an ongoing basis. So that's my final word.
Super last final question, comment.
Hello. I'm not Jewish, and I don't have any Jewish friends or family, so the only... I know.
We'll be your friend.
Thank you.
Hey, buddy.
I've really enjoyed this discussion tonight. It's been fantastic. The only real exposure I had to any kind of Jewish humor, I guess, was Mad Magazine from the very beginning, which I have to thank my dad for. And then about 10 years or so ago, I discovered Elaine Kaminski Crumb, and I fell in love with her. Especially love the way that she portrays her mother, with this demonic beast with these, you know, the teeth and the eyes and the craziness. And then I started doing comics myself a little bit. So my question was, are there many Jewish female comic book artists? And I mean, Miriam, of course. And it was also a question for you. Do you find yourself identifying more as a Jewish comic artist or as a female comic artist? And has it been like a help or a hindrance in breaking into the scene?
I think that there are more, in indie comics these days, there are more and more women as well, which I find is very encouraging. I mean, not just for not being the only girl in the room, but also because, you know, I do think that especially when things are autobio or when things are life-based in one way or another, you know, it's good to have women in there because they have different experiences. And so I think I really identify as both in different ways, you know, as a Jew writing comics and as a woman writing comics. And there are also starting to be more and more Jewish female artists, and they are mostly, it seems like they are mostly in the confessional vein. And in fact, there's going to be a show that the Cartooning Art Museum is going to do here. I think it's going to be next year, that I'm a part of, that is all about, I think it's called Graphic Details is what the show is going to be called, and it's about autobiographical Jewish women in comics, and it seems like there's a lot of them like kind of right around my age, you know, 25 to 35 sort of age bracket. And I think that Elaine Kaminski has been an influence on a lot of people because her style is just, it's deliberately unpolished. You know, as Arkram is fond of pointing out, you know, she went to art school and he didn't. But it's just raw and expressive and kind of goes places that, you know, nice Jewish girls don't. And that has been an influence, I think, on a lot of younger generations. And just because, you know, you do feel part of the Jewish tradition, but you also feel like the Jewish stories that have been being told are maybe not necessarily your stories. And so, you know, you want to tell your stories because that's what comics makes us do, as you yourselves have seen. And so, yeah, if you look, there's like Escape from Special by Miss Lasco Gross, came out from Fantagraphics a couple of years ago. There's, oh man, there's a bunch, yeah.
There's also, I'm going to blank on the names now because I'm under the spotlight, but there was that famous, there's a lot from the original Underground, that Twisted Sisters volume has a Dora Frida.
Trina Robbins has also
Right.
done a lot, and Sharon Rudolph.
Yeah, and the wife of Bill Griffith, what's her name? She, God, I can't remember her name right now. And then Dora, who's the one who, she died, she passed away. She was a seminal early Jewish cartoonist from the Haight-Ashbury scene and all that. But I mean, they're out there, definitely. There's like a whole lineage.
And there's more every day.
There are Jewish women in the DC universe too, writing, and I wish I could remember whether it's Devin Grayson or somebody else, but she got her start by writing a pornographic Batman novel, and when DC saw it, instead of suing her, they hired her. So there are these bad girls writing Jewish, even Superman and Batman.
Friends,
Right.
thank you very much.
Thank you.